And just last night, I pulled all this stuff out and put it on my desktop and read through quickly both my notes and also some of the text.
Well, I'm going to make that the first thing we say in this video then, Ruth. Thank you so much for getting all your readings out last night and for taking time to think about the history of higher education so that the students who are coming in this class have a broader sense of the university, something that goes back, before the 12th century in England. So for the students who are joining us, this is Dr. Ruth Hayhoe, and Ruth started the course in comparative higher education. And as you know from our intro video, Ruth was very fascinated by the fall of the Berlin Wall and that all the paradigms that they had used to analyze, first world, second world, third world, or and these developing nation sort of ideas were all based on sort of a materialist view, these theoretical frameworks that only looked at the political economy of the nations. And after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Ruth, what did you begin to realize about how the divisions that were shaping higher education in countries were being revealed?
Well, it was, really a fascinating time. We're looking at the very early 1990s, and nobody really anticipated the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the world that we knew at that time was the world of the Cold War, with the socialist world on one side and the capitalist world on the other side. And we tended to compare higher education within those two frames as being either developed or developing, on either side. But we really didn't think beyond that. And then very shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, we had this remarkable article coming out from Harvard, Samuel
Mm.
Huntington, on the clash of civilizations. And in there, he's predicting that future conflict is not going to be about political systems. It's going to be much, much deeper. It's going to go into world civilizations. And of course, that was really the 90s. Is it going to be a clash or is it going to be a dialogue? And that I just felt, I took that, I was so happy we were able to hold a conference in Toronto in 1992. 10 years later, the second version of the book came out, Knowledge Across Cultures. And the whole purpose of this was to bring scholars from parts of the world that had very ancient higher learning traditions rooted in different religions and civilizations. We actually focused on India, the Middle East, and China, and to listen to what they had contributed to the Western University, that the medieval University of Europe, which was taken as the model and the beginning point for higher education, and this notion had been spread around because of colonialism and because of the dominance of the West for centuries, actually owed a great deal to these other civilizations. And we needed to hear their voices
Mhm.
and understand, their traditions of higher learning and how they had contributed and what had been the dialogue. And so the whole 1990s was really, is it going to be clash
Mhm.
or is it going to be dialogue? And the other point I thought was very important, I'll just say that briefly before we go on into this. In the Western world, universities have become very secular because they were dominated by a scientific ethic which emphasized value neutral investigation. And of course, there are many positive things about that and the discoveries of science. But religion really had a very little role to play and was not given very much attention. But as soon as we got the dialogue of civilization, so it was a recognition of how important religion continued to be in different parts of the world, in the Islamic world, in India, also, of course, in the West, and that it needed to be recognized and understood and brought back in. And so what I thought was really wonderful was at the end of this period, in the year 2001, the United Nations called for a dialogue among civilizations and
Mhm.
invited leaders from different parts of the world, both religious and civilizational and historical. For China, Du Weiming was the famous scholar that they invited, to really bring back a much deeper epistemological understanding that would be, of course, very important for universities. So let me stop there.
Oh, but Ruth, it's so, my students are really resonating with that. So many of my students want to bring their whole selves to the classroom, and that means their worldviews, the beliefs and values that have come from their families, as well as their own spirituality that they're developing as adults. And because we have such a strong strain in the higher education program for student development and student services, there's a deep human connectedness to that. And so I love this week because we look historically at universities and colleges, or higher learning, because they weren't called universities and colleges. We look at higher learning traditions where spirituality and the networks of the community and the culture are the foundational pieces for how the higher learning was set up. And so even though we are the Western university, in the Rochdale reading, the medieval university starting in the 12th century is very different than what we have today. And I think we can look at it in terms of just even starting with the discipline. So how would you view our history in the Western University coming out of this Anglo tradition with Rochdale? What are the features of that institution? What do we still see today, and what has changed dramatically?
Yeah, I think if you look at something like the core values of the university, and I think almost every university president will say academic freedom, institutional autonomy, some independence from government, direct government control, and freedom to explore new ideas and new thinking. And those are very much rooted in the European University. And I think Rashtal brings out that quite nicely by saying, there were three powers. So it's the imperial power, there was the religious power of the Pope, and then there was the university. And the university was actually given a charter. And that legal charter gave it a status. This is before the nation state, but we're talking about, the whole of Europe and what was the known world at that time, for those institutions to be able to control the kinds of knowledge they were teaching, the kinds of debates that went on, their organization. And of course, Rochdale points out that the university doesn't necessarily mean universal. They took different emphases. So Paris was the center for theology, Salerno for medicine, Bologna, I think, for law. So they had these different fields, but they used the term studium generale, which meant students are welcome from anywhere, and they can come and they can live in the town and they can study and they can explore freely. So it was an institution that went beyond the local political authorities of the city or the region, and had this kind of independence. I think that is probably the key point that is still continued now. And it's interesting how it was protected by the Cessadio, they could go on strike, or Migratio, the little towns of Europe were happy to have a university. And if the mayor stomped on it, okay, we'll just move away. We'll move to, I think that's the story between Oxford and Cambridge. One of them had,
Absolutely. They
yeah,
split in
so,
one move.
they had that independence. And that
Yeah.
was the need for an independent place for knowledge to grow.
And I think what's so fascinating when we look at the relationship between society and the university is that it has changed dramatically with the idea of higher education for the masses and the connection that we now expect to the labor market. And so we have the pillars in our universities of academic freedom, institutional autonomy, but the position in terms of the labor market, the education of young adults, and the massification has altered. And so when students are choosing research topics for their papers, I want them to think even more broadly, actually, than just North America and Europe or the historic view, but to consider across the civilizations that we look at, what was the relationship between this institution of higher learning and the broader society? What were the beliefs about control, independence, membership? What were the connections to whether it's a civil service or religious order or the labor market? We have so many different strains that we can explore in those areas. And I do have a question about the Chinese Shuyuans, because when we talk about being separate from the sort of imperial control and being a little bit apart from the society, but being the space of intellect, do we see parallels between the Chinese system in any way?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question because I think on the one hand, you have the guild, which was protected by law. But on the other hand, you had the monastery, and that was the place where all the books piled up and where people studied and where they were pursuing knowledge more for its own sake than for its service. And the fascinating thing about the Shuyuan, they actually came from India. The ideas, Buddhist monks from India and Chinese monks who went to India and brought back the ideas and then created them outside the cities in rural area where they had a considerable amount of independence that wouldn't be directly interfered by the emperor. And they were able to pursue knowledge in a way for its own sake in a quiet environment, and in some cases be critical of the system. And I felt that was in the Chinese case, that was a wonderful balance to a civil service exam system totally controlled by government, which had positive elements of meritocracy, of highly educated officials running the country, but also needed to have another side. And in the Chinese case, the distinction is greater. Whereas in the European case, universities had some degree of that, but to a large extent, they were separate bodies, not necessarily influencing the political system or even feeling that much responsibility. I think that's so interesting in the second reading that you have, where he talks about the Scottish university was really the only one that was both highly scientific and also committed to social reform and social issues and so on. Whereas the original medieval university was much more knowledge for its own sake and protecting knowledge. And if it did make a difference, that's fine, but that wasn't the main purpose.
I'm also thinking right now, of the student protests we have across campuses in Canada and the US. And what is that belief, that core belief that these students have about what this institution has taught us, what we expect it to do, and how we expect it to impact society? Because when you think about the Scottish University and its ability to reform society, to sort of have this application to bettering society, it's really has parallels with what we have now. So this is my shout out to my students. When you're designing your final paper, try to ask one of these higher order questions about what the broader purpose of the institution was, or who were the members, or what the role of students is within that. There are a lot of really neat questions you can ask of all of these places. Now, one of the pieces, Ruth, that I have always been fascinated by is the connections between the civilizations. So you've mentioned that the scholarship from India was taken by the Buddhist monks back to India to help set up these Shuyuans. But there's also a really strong role for the European universities in the work that the Islamic institutions did with their incredible libraries before the invention of what we consider the modern university, like Cambridge and Harvard. So what was the role of those Islamic institutions during sort of the 800 to 1200 time?
I think that's really a good question. And I feel the Nakustine reading is a demanding one, but it highlights Jundisapur, which is now it would be Iran, was Persia in those days. And if you go back in history, the Persian Empire was one of the most open empires. If you look at the history of the Jewish people, that's the Persian Empire allowed them to go home when they were all in exile. So that's an interesting piece of the story. And so Arabic scholarship, starting very, very early, actually, was very, very important for the sciences, very important. One of the areas of particular excellence was optics and understanding optics. And then the other thing was the incredible translation projects that went on, from ancient Greek, Latin. A lot of the Greek, Euclid's geometry got translated into Arabic and then back into Latin for Europe. I mean, it was very, very fascinating how they collected major works of scientific progress, translated them, collected them, and Jundisapur was a kind of place where scholars from all over could come and collect. And I think Nakustine is very right in emphasizing without that basis. So basically the sciences from the Arabic world, the medieval European university could never have made the kind of progress that it made, from about 14th, 15th, 16th century leading up to the scientific enlightenment. So, mathematics from India, but physics and optics really through the Arabic world. And I think Nakustine gives you a lovely introduction to that. And then Cadi's a fascinating piece because that was 2006, not long after the 9/11, right? And Comparative Ed Review said, let's ask the world, what did the Islamic world contribute to education? 54 articles came in, and they had to just choose a few. And Cadi kind of introduces it. So that was something that just suddenly somehow got forgotten, but it was so important to the scientific revolution and the development of the European university. Yeah.
And I think we have this tension because, like, as you're saying, we actually see the preservation of knowledge, the building on the knowledge of other societies when we look at what the Islamic universities contributed to that time before the medieval universities. And yet we have debates now about colonial imposition versus borrowing. How do we know? How do we know when we're just borrowing great ideas to build on them, or when colonial powers are imposing a model that has this sort of hegemonic Western view? I think that's what our students struggle with when they dive into the research on colonialism. Where has there been damage because of the imposition of other ways of knowing, and where has there actually been a borrowing and a synergy that allows us to like sort of further different disciplines? I've really struggled with that too.
Yeah, and I think we need some sort of a model of dialogue and integration. When I was writing the paper, I think some of you might have seen it, for Cambodia, about the Indian influence on Cambodia and how Indian monks really set up the whole scientific system, brought texts and helped and so on. But what was so fascinating for me as I learned and read about that was they did not impose any social patterns from India. So there was no subordination of classes or putting down or anything. It was purely a sharing of knowledge that went on, and involved translation from ancient Indian languages into Cambodian Khmer language. And I think over history, you can just, that this is a kind of frame that we have to put on to kind of evaluate, how far is this an imposition? How far is this putting down, the local patterns in favor of a supposedly more advanced model, and the degree to which it influences the social institutions and structures. And I think that can actually be measured. So what I tried to do when I was looking at China, because my greatest fear was when China opened after the Cultural Revolution, that we would have another imposition. In the 1950s, the Soviet Union fully imposed a Western model that came really out of 19th century France, highly specialized, totally unsuitable to the Chinese roots and epistemology. And the result was it was totally rejected, and there was a lot of violence in the rejection. So as China opened to the West, how could we measure? I actually did comparisons among different Western countries. The degree to which the introduction of knowledge patterns or structures was a matter of dialogue in which there was full participation from the Chinese side and determination what would fit and work for them, as against, you have to do it this way, otherwise you're not going to be able to become modern, which has happened so much in the colonial process. So I think the whole post-colonial literature and the sort of reflections on decolonization is very important to connect to, while at the same time recognizing there are examples when it really didn't happen. India and Cambodia is one of the wonderful cases for me. That was a surprise to me to see that. And I think there are also many other cases. For example, the Christian missionaries in China, some of them embraced some of the Buddhist texts and tried to show the parallels and tried to develop forms of liberal arts that would be rooted in China's own traditions while also connecting to the international. So you can look at both national cases, but also you can look at specific examples, and compare them. And one may be more a matter of imposition. Another may be more a matter of genuine dialogue and listening. I think the West never learned to listen. That was the biggest problem with colonialism. They just thought, we know what it is. We'll just tell you and you have to do it.
And then when we did go in as observers from this sort of values neutral place in fields like anthropology, the historic roots of that are very much like we're the experts. So even where we're observing, or we're still studying as objects the other, which is something that anthropology has had a huge sort of critical revision in, which is exciting. So I want to summarize a little bit of what you said for our research strain students, and for those of you who want to take a more analytical and theoretical approach to your papers. So whenever we're beginning to look at two civilizations or two approaches to educational borrowing or the dialogue across nations, we need to have a framework. And so what Dr. Hayheo has helped us to see is that we can begin to draw on the work of early comparativists to analyze whether or not this is something that is an imposition, and what are the features that we're going to draw on to set up a framework for us so that we actually have features or characteristics that we can then use to sort of measure or evaluate the extent to which this educational borrowing is an imposition or is a dialogue. And so that's where the work of Weber and Ruth's emphasis with Brian Holmes' work on ideal types and can be really, really helpful, that we can begin to develop analytic frameworks that have characteristics, almost prototypes that help you to see, is it this or is it that? And we're not trying to make our case studies match either one, but they help us to see to what extent we can analyze something in either category. So I hope that's helpful, but I do want to encourage our research strain students, particularly our PhD students, to begin to think of what conceptual framework you're using for this paper, what conceptual framework you're using for your PhD, to be able to really clarify these ideas, because you can actually begin to sort it out, because not every situation looking back in history is a colonial imposition. And Ruth, you've often said there are also things that persist, that one of the most interesting questions is, after colonial imposition, what things from the culture and the ancient civilization actually have persisted? And where have you seen, I'd love to know examples that you have seen of fascinating pieces that have persisted, whether in the Chinese case or the Islamic case.
Yeah, for example, within the Chinese case, there's always been the assumption that Confucianism was something that subordinated women. They had to obey their husband, their father, their son, and so on. And therefore they would, it would be much more difficult for them to move into leadership and full participation, equal participation in higher education. But when I actually looked at the case of China as it transferred into a modern higher education, because of the nature of epistemology in Confucianism, and because of the kind of thinking, whereas in the West it had been a kind of big struggle, for the Chinese, there was a lot more possibility and understanding, because their basic epistemological patterns fitted very well with women's ways of knowing, even though their imperial structures had excluded women. And so once women connected to that, and so there's some wonderful examples of the early women leaders of universities in China, where you see possibilities coming out of their own culture, supporting them, as against, the assumptions that, women are definitely secondary citizens and have always been put down and so on. So you have to look very carefully. And I'm so glad you mentioned ideal types, because I think you can actually create an ideal type of mutuality. I love the World Order Models Project, and I found that several scholars have recently been started to work with it again. That was a group that started in India in the 1970s. And they put forward 4 values: equity, autonomy, solidarity, participation. And so for any cross-cultural collaboration, can we see these 4? Which one is missing? Why is it missing? What would genuine mutuality look like? And to actually do a value explicit mutuality. But you can separate those 4 dimensions, and you can measure how far, comparatively, perhaps 2 or 3 different cases, it's possible to reach that greater degree of mutuality. And that's really what we need for dialogue. And I really think Johan Galtung, of course, the founder of peace studies, he worked with scholars, a group of scholars in India and Africa. Ali Mazrui was the one I admired greatly, and others, to create this frame for the social sciences, which instead of being value neutral, was value explicit. And then we define the ideal. We know that probably can't reach that ideal, but we can measure how close do we get to it. And then we can, as scholars, make some kind of value judgment, because that's been the problem with the value neutral approach. The idea that scholars can only predict, but they can't judge. but we should be able to make judgments. And I think that world order model's frame is pretty global. It's not, I don't see any particular culture or region that would not be able to agree with equity, autonomy, solidarity, and participation, those four. So I worked with that for a long time. And I was kind of sorry that it never became very mainstream in comparative education, because I think it's really very helpful when you're looking at cross-cultural interactions.
Well, in the week that the students are, I think it'll be the week before they watch this video, where the students are really grappling with comparative education as a field versus comparative higher education. One of the big conversations in the readings is the is versus the ought. Are we just studying what is to document it, to analyze it, categorize it? Or are we adding, there should be this, there ought to be this into it? Is our own values and understandings underlying the research we do? And of course, for so many of our students who coming in with a almost postmodern pluralistic assumptions about the world that they've grown up with in the Canadian context, they have quite an easy time holding those tensions. They would say, of course, everything I do is informed by my own positionality and my own lived experience. And so then within the frameworks that we use to analyze, how do we account for that in a systematic and still rigorous way? I'm glad you brought up epistemology, because as much as I think students occasionally run from this term, wondering, I don't totally get what it means. I think we see when we try and understand the position of religion now versus the position of religion, say in the Islamic universities, where they actually were gathering and collecting and documenting things, very open to new ideas. There's this underlying epistemology of one truth versus many truths, or the ability to see truth more broadly. And that is something that as I think scientific research, philosophical research stays within the university, and religion in North America, fringe religion has stayed outside of that, some more extreme groups. There is this debate between truth being a multifaceted concept and truth being this one thing that we have to hold on to rather than exploratory and understanding. And I think some of our students would identify with that, maybe whether it's the culture they've come from. But I think that for me, it was very illuminating to understand how the early monks from my own Christian tradition had deeply had documented, had explored and studied that truth was much more of a broad concept than perhaps I was led to understand. And so this is why this course meant a lot to me, is we look at so many cultural and religious traditions to understand the broadness of truth within that. Yeah. So Ruth, as we look at these readings for these students, what would be a couple of takeaways that they could do as they think about using history to analyze what's happening now? What can we learn? Like, and I don't mean the actual questions necessarily, the sort of specific research questions, but what sort of an approach or posture do they take as they look at history and begin to consider what's happening now? How might they use these sort of readings for current day analysis?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, we have such troubled situations going on right now in the Middle East, in Ukraine and Russia and other parts of the world. And to me, and students are very, very concerned. Obviously, we can see that with the protests that are going on at the moment and so on. So it seems to me, I've been listening to news and so on, and looking back over history at how higher learning and students have been able to contribute in positive ways to the resolution of deep conflict and misunderstanding, hopefully rooted in, a deeper respect and knowledge and understanding, not simply technical or geopolitical considerations, which are always, of course, going to be there. So it seems to me there's many historical cases that one can look at. I think of China, I think of the May 4th movement. I mean, that was an amazing time in which the intellectual community helped China to shift, in a very, very important way towards a more progressive, away from, it was a time of conflict with Japan, it was a time of terrible conflict. So it seems to me right now, those who are very concerned about, the geopolitics that are going on, to take a historical piece that you have some knowledge of or some ability to analyze and try to see, how students, universities, knowledge patterns could contribute to some kind of resolution and positive movement forward, could be a very worthwhile and rewarding approach. What we feel right now is things are happening so fast, people don't have time to listen, to each other, or to listen to the other side, or to really take seriously the other side. And if anything, in a university community, we have to learn how to listen and go deeply into the other and understand it, rather than just move automatically with, the political pressures that we see outside and around us. So, as I've been very troubled just watching the news and seeing the conflicts that are going on. And it's been interesting, the different commentaries I've been hearing on the news, from scholars who sort of look back at history and take examples and give cases, where not only in the history, but even in the current time, where there is a resolution that's moving things in a positive way. So I think that's where comparative higher education can be very helpful.
And one
I'm
of the
glad you asked.
well, it's been on my mind because I see the
Yeah.
student protest and I see the debates in the media are often, what should the administration do? And I think the administration should listen to their students, because history tells us that students can sometimes be the conscience for what we're working on right now. If students, we have a struggle, we have something where there's a debate, and our students are calling for peace, right? This is what we want for them. And so you're right, this course actually there will be a group focusing on student protest movements for their final presentation, and to be able to have that historic look beyond what's happening right now, to see how, as you've put it, the intellectual community can help move the nation in the right direction. So that's I think a lot of hope for us as we study the university. And I love your point about listening. I feel contradictory because this is a compressed course, so we're going through our material very quickly. But diving into a research topic, going into research articles, can help to be the antithesis to, fast news stories and quick sound bites. We want you to deeply think about these issues, to analyze them, to sort them, to reflect on them in ways that help you make sense of them, and hopefully to move some of these big issue areas forward. So Ruth, thank you for this meaningful conversation. I have always valued your mentorship, and we're so thankful to have you as part of this course still. And we'll have you
I'm
again.
looking forward to the opportunity to meet with students. I know we're going to do it on Zoom,
Yep.
and go further into any points that you want to raise and discuss. And I'm so glad that the course is proving to be helpful and inspirational.
It is. So that's our message to the students. Bring your questions to the Q&A with Ruth in a couple of weeks, and make sure that you have a question prepared, because there's no way you understood all those readings. So please bring real questions. Have a great day. Thank you, Ruth.